My name's Luke. I was born and raised in Geelong to an immigrant father. He's from Norway, and my mum, who's also born and bred in Geelong. They were quite young parents. I think 21 and 22 at the time when I was born, and they sort of had a bit of a tumultuous relationship, I suppose you'd say, which eventually led to my parents splitting up when I was about 10 years old. I had a little sister by then, and when mum and dad split up, it was, I would say it was probably a bit harder on mum because she was looking after us full time, and dad wasn't so much in the picture. I suppose you'd say, because we'd just see him every second weekend. I don't know all the particulars of it, but all I do remember is that for both mum and dad, their mental health suffered quite a lot, and living with mum, a lot of days she just couldn't get out of bed, and the house was it was not a great place to live in, like both physically and mentally. Mentally, it was very demanding for anyone, like as an adult or as a child. It was it's difficult to think and talk about even now. I've spoken about it many times, but it's it still gets me right in the heart. I We lived in a housing commission home, and it was in an area called Clifton Springs down in Geelong, which is on the Bellarine Peninsula. Not everyone's going to be familiar with the area, but it's a half decent sort of coastal area, working class, and growing up in an area like that, but with absolutely no money, and going to school with kids with that have parents that all have full-time jobs and that not necessarily suffering from mental health issues and whatever else. It really sort of ate away at me a lot, I think, and started to manifest a lot of thoughts that a young kid shouldn't have to have. Uh, this is by no means any fault of my mum or my dad as such. They just weren't equipped to deal with it at the time, I don't think, but it was nonetheless difficult. Things got that bad at one point. I remember this. I still don't know who it is to this day, but they used to do shopping, and they would drop the shopping to our front doorstep, knock on the door, and run off. And I still remember getting like iced coffee, Big M's. It gives me goosebumps just thinking about iced coffee, Big M's. I don't drink them so much now because I'm a little bit more health conscious, but just having little, it doesn't seem like much of a luxury to have an iced coffee, Big M, but to have something like that available for you in the fridge was massive. I also recall getting like the bread from the local bakers dropped to our house that hadn't been purchased through the day. It was part of one of the local charity programs, and it was a little bit sad that we're getting given these items. I suppose it was touching at the same time because we had that community support there, but in that I learned a very valuable lesson to start being resourceful at that age, where a lot of the bread would be stale, and I'd actually light a fire in the backyard, wrap the bread in foil, and put it in the coals. And then when I brought it back out and I broke the bread open, it was like it was fresh. And I suppose a lot of people would think that's kind of sad, but to me that's really nice. I'm glad that I had that experience because it's gifted me abilities and ways of thinking for later on in life that enabled me to cope with some of the hardships that I've had to endure. After we worked through that part of our lives, Mum ended up meeting a new partner who introduced a fair bit of stability into our lives. which, obviously with that, mum was able to gain full-time employment and bills were getting paid. Mum was a lot happier. In turn, my sister and I were a lot happier, and we started to find a sense of normality. I still had a lot of demons that I carried from things that were happening throughout my childhood that I don't necessarily need to delve into. But it meant that I wasn't able to socialize in a normal capacity, or I'd act out a lot. People would think that I was a bit of a larrikin, or I'd have a lot of people laugh at my own expense, but it was because I had really bad depression at the time, and it was a sort of a type of self-harm, I suppose you would say. I never felt as though I could reach out to anybody and ask for help, which later on, me learning that has been a massive thing. It's helped me out in business, and I'll revisit that a bit later. But I carried on with life through my teenage years. Played sport, fortunately. I got through year 12, which was great. But then, just as things sort of started to really come together for me, I suppose you'd say, my sister, one night, I was 17 years old at the time, just finished high school. My sister came into my room, inconsolable. She was crying. It was about 1 o'clock in the morning, and I was asking her, what's wrong, and she couldn't talk. And then eventually she got it out that my stepdad, who was my mum's new partner, had sexually assaulted her, which obviously threw a bit of a spanner in the works. Had to run through the streets that night in our pajamas, both crying to a friend's house that lived nearby, and we were knocking on the door asking for help, and the friend's dad answered the door and was asking us questions. Why are you knocking on the door at this time of night? What's going on? I tried to briefly explain the situation, and he was acting a little bit funny about it and was reluctant to help us, even though I'd explained what had happened. Anyway, we ended up going in there and calling my dad, and then that all went to the police and whatever else. It ended up turning out that my friend's father, who answered the door that night, was also a pedophile. And for the next 4 years of my life, I spent dealing with a lot of that situation, supporting my sister through the court process, and supporting my friend through that court process, which was very taxing on me. It completely consumed me, and I never stopped to think that I would potentially need help. Well, in saying that, that's probably not true. Actually, I just thought that it wasn't an option, because I'd been taught earlier in life by my own dad, who'd been taught by his dad the same thing, and his dad before that a man cops it on the chin, and he just accepts the situation that he's in, and he deals with it. And for me, that meant that I don't talk about my emotions or how things are impacting me, because I couldn't find somebody that had a good emotional intelligence to direct me through these situations. And going to counselling, any social workers, was completely out of the question, because as far as I was concerned, that was not part of being a man, and that was showing weakness. So I just had to carry it for myself. At the age of 21, I eventually, mum had moved away. She moved to first Ballarat and then to Queensland with my sister, and I'd opted to stay in Geelong because that's where my friends were, and I still played footy and played a lot of sport, which I'd used as an escape I've used exercise as an escape for my whole life, but there was no chance that I was leaving any of that under any circumstances. So I decided to move out on my own. After a while, well, this had been going on my whole life, that I hadn't dealt with depression, but I didn't even have mum to answer to anymore, or I'd alienated myself from my dad as well, because I couldn't, I just couldn't communicate with them, and they weren't equipped to deal with somebody that had mental health issues. So I ended up turning to going out every Friday, Saturday night. Had absolutely no money. Ended up homeless for a little while there. I can't remember whether it was 4, 5, 6 months. I'm not 100% sure, but I somehow, in the meantime, managed to secure an apprenticeship as an electrician. What I'd do is I'd have absolutely no money to purchase lunch at work, so I'd go to work, and then I'd tell my bosses that I was earning $280 a week at the time. I'd tell my bosses that I was going to buy lunch, and they're sort of going, "That's not adding up. That's a bit funny," but they never sort of asked me about it. They just went, "Yeah, no worries." But what I'd do is on smoke, on lunch, I'd just drive around the corner. I'd sit there on my phone, because the shame, the pain of shame to me, or asking for help, was it far outweighed any hunger pains that I could experience. And what eventually ended up happening was that there was a promotion at McDonald's that was running for a double beef and cheeseburger for $1 at the time, and I always had spare change and stuff from going out on the town, because that's all I'd spend my money on, was going nightclubbing and getting pissed on the weekend, so that I didn't have to think about my reality from the day to day. So I was scrounging around. I went to this McDonald's. I parked in the car park, and I thought, I can surely find $1 in my car. So my Ford Festiva Trio S it was, and I scrounged around for, it would have been about 15 minutes. I had 20 minutes for lunch, and I ended up just coming up with 95 cents, which, it struck me down really, really bad. It was the first time that I'd actually cried in a long time, because I'd become so emotionally numb. And I'm not a super spiritual man. I definitely wasn't at the time, but in that moment, I just felt like there was a God, and he was doing everything in his power to screw me over, and he had done for my entire life. But in that moment of absolute desperation, something just flicked in my brain, and I attribute that partially to the mentality of having to take things upon myself and do anything within my power to change my situation. But I just started to laugh through the tears, and I thought, you know what, you watch movies, and this is the stuff that happens. Of course, it's going to go this way. 95 cents when I need $1. It's like, come on, you've got to do something about this. You can't keep going on this way. No one else is going to help you. It's up to you to change it. So I got my 95 cents in my pocket, and I thought, you know what, likely if I go through the drive-through, I'm going to say I want a double beef and cheese. I'll go through to the girl at the window. I'll hand her 95 cents. She'll go, "It's only 95 cents." And I'll go, oh, hang on. I'll look around for the 5 cents. She'll say, "Don't worry." So I did that. Sure enough, it played out exactly that way. I got my double beef and cheese. I had something to eat. I was pretty stoked about that. But then I still decided in that moment, I'm gonna do whatever it takes to get out of this situation, because I've hit rock bottom, and there's nowhere else to go except for dying. Unfortunately, because I didn't have a solid male role model in my life at the time, I constructed an idea in my head, just off of my own bat, as to what was going to deliver me from that situation. Because I was going out on the town all the time, I was heavily influenced by that lifestyle, and that opportunity presented itself in drugs. I was always heavily against drugs my whole life for my own personal reasons, but this became about survival. The morals and principles went out the window to, I'd say, to the full extent, and I just needed to get somewhere to live. And because of my drive and my application and taking things, I've always been a very considerate person because of my own experiences. I've learned a lot about the way that people think, how people are going to respond to particular situations, and what that ended up meaning was that it was the perfect mix to be a drug dealer and a business person. And unfortunately for me, I was really good at it. I I all of a sudden went from being like a bit of a larrikin at a party to being a very likable person, because I also had a lot of money in my pocket and a lot of party drugs. So this really just went to my head, and I ended up obviously getting off the street. And then I started living with a friend because I had the money to do so. But then that wasn't enough for me because I didn't have any sense of direction. And this, I, I remember the first time that I got paid more from selling drugs than I did from my apprenticeship, and that was just the most amazing feeling. And I thought, this is the answer to all my problems. It's going to solve everything. So I ended up working my full-time job, and then I was living a second life Monday to Friday. Like I was working 16 hours, 20 hours a day, but just making deals and meeting people and trying to appear in a certain way. And things escalated quite quickly. And what it eventually ended up meaning was about 3 years down the track, I came under an undercover investigation. And after 6 month undercover operation, I was arrested and charged with trafficking a large commercial quantity of MDMA and cocaine, which carries a maximum term of imprisonment of life. So for me to be able to get bail, I had to provide exceptional circumstances, which I just didn't have. I was a youth offender. But like, apart from having mental health issues, there was no other reason for me to, which you can get treatment for while you're in prison. So there was no way that I was getting bail. 6 months prior to me getting locked up, I'd met my partner, who I'm still with today, and yeah, she's a very strong-willed lady, and she sees things from a different angle to myself, which is very fortunate for me going through this whole process. And she had very strong boundaries around myself and the way that I was living. She wasn't aware of what I was doing up until right before I got arrested, at which point she said, "You're either doing that or you're with me." And I said that I was going to continue doing that for a bit, and then I'd wind things up, and then we could revisit it. But then that decision got made for me, fortunately. And I still remember the day that I got arrested. I said that I'll be back shortly because I was feeling very smug. I had no idea the evidence that the coppers had on me at the time. And I got taken back to the police station, and they lumped the charges on me, and then I was in the holding cells for about 10 days before I had one of the police officers, because I was always I still used my manners. I didn't hold any untowards towards the police officer because I put myself in that position. I always acknowledge that. I'd had a few letters of support dropped to me by friends and family and my partner that I wasn't aware of, and I just didn't think that anyone would care at this time. And right up until this point, I just hadn't felt anything. I hadn't felt a single thing. I was not scared. it's hard for people to imagine, but it wasn't a tough guy thing. It was honestly, it's a very weak thing, because that's just what I needed to do to live the life that I had lived. I'm not talking about just a criminal life. I'm talking about my life all the way up until this point. I needed to not feel, so that I didn't feel the pain of my reality, because otherwise I just wouldn't have survived. And I received these letters. One was from my dad, who I hadn't talked to in years by this point. Same with my mum, my nana, my my sister, and Kat, which is my partner. And none of these letters of support were from any of the people that I thought were my friends, while I was living this criminal lifestyle. And that again, that cut me to the core. And um, since that time where I broke down in the car in the Macca's parking lot, I hadn't cried, and that got me once more. And I started to think, what's wrong with the person to not be scared of looking at that time. If I had have gone down for large commercial, I was looking at between 8 and 10 years jail, given my circumstances. And I just started to think, you know what? Again, I've got to, this time I've got to do whatever it takes to get myself out of this situation. But it's not necessarily about surviving. I know I can survive. It's about actually doing good in the world, and thriving in my situation, being happy and healthy, because I was getting by, but I wasn't happy and healthy. And I had a conversation, like my life was stripped back with all my family. Everything was completely transparent now. I had nowhere to go. I couldn't hide, which was a great thing. And I had a conversation with my mum, and I guaranteed her that if she was never going to go anywhere. Like that, that's a mother's nature, more often than not. But I promised her that I would, do right by her, and I'll get myself back on track. But I told her everything that had been going on, and I guess that was me reaching out for help. But the really important one, or not really important one, it was probably the biggest one that I talk about, is a conversation with my partner. That early on, I said, we outlined what it would mean for me to be in a relationship while I was in prison, and how she would deal with it, and what our expectations were and whatever. Once we sort of came to an agreement, she wrote a letter into me, and I responded to it, saying that I'd felt like I'd been a lost little boy my whole life, but I was going to work my ass off to become the man that she deserves on the other side of this. And I essentially made myself vulnerable and put my hand up for needing help. And as soon as I did that, and I had a clearly defined goal, all of the distractions just seemed to be really really easy to swat off, which were, like anything from television through to binge eating, anything. I found it really easy to stay on task, because if I needed to move heaven and earth to achieve that goal, I was going to do it, and I knew that it really mattered to me. So I used that time to ask different people while I was in prison. If I saw somebody that was in a really strong relationship, I would ask them, all right, how do you go about having happy and healthy relationships? If I saw somebody that was good with business, I would talk to them about that. Or I would read a lot of books, and I would train with personal trainers, or anything that I could pick people's brains. By the time I was released from prison, I would like to say that I had achieved that goal, and it put me in a position where I was ready to succeed. And I linked up with, or already having started an apprenticeship as an electrician, but having a bit of business now, although in an illegitimate sense. I knew how to now apply it in a legitimate sense, and how to start a business from a lot of the conversations and tutelage that I'd had in my time in prison. And I linked up with my partner's brother and another bloke that I know who's an electrical engineer, and went out and started an electrical company, which 1 year down the track, we now have 8 employees, which has been pretty rapid growth. But again, it's been just down to some serious dedication and application. And on the side as well, I've been working on a concept that's going to help to mitigate risk factors for corrections Victoria, as well as providing transitional employment opportunities to people in the correction system, which will help to prevent recidivism and save the taxpayer a whole lot of money. And that pretty much brings me to where I'm at today, and how I've come to link up with Amy as well, which is I've been doing a lot of mentoring, and been fortunate enough to be involved in a documentary that is all about overcoming adversity and transitioning from that survival mindset to that thriving mindset. And that's something that's really close to my heart, and why I think it's so important for somebody such as myself to share my story.